How many of you remember seeing the television show MASH? I'm not talking about reruns. I'm talking about like when it came out. How many remember seeing that television show MASH? Okay. Now, I know that's a little bit of a dated show, but MASH was one of the best television shows ever on television. In fact, did you know this? That the final episode of MASH, remember that big grand finale? Remember that? The final show, television episode of MASH, broke the record for the highest percentages of homes to ever tune into a television show in American television history. It was that good. So, if you remember MASH well, who was your favorite character on that show? Anyone? Anyone? Huh? Hawkeye was your favorite character? Yeah? Yeah? Father Mulcahy, good. Jocularities, exactly. I remember that. Some of us, it was Hawkeye Pierce, right? Some of us, it was, remember Corporal Klinger? How could you forget Corporal Klinger, right? For some of us, we thought Hot Lips Houlihan was our favorite character, right? And then still others of us, bumbling old Colonel Blake. You know, I loved all of those characters, but one of my least favorite characters was Major Charles Emerson Winchester III. Remember that guy? Charles Emerson Winchester. He was that snobby, blue blood Boston doctor who absolutely hated being stationed on the front lines of the Korean War, and he hated doing meatball surgery at the 407th MASH. Consequently, he was always whining, wasn't he? Always complaining. He was always playing the part of a victim. Winchester's mantra during that television show might have been this: life is so unfair. Exactly. Life is so unfair. It could be said that Charles Emerson Winchester III was living in exile. This evening I want to talk to us for a few minutes about what it means to live in exile. What does that mean for us today here in Leland? Well, you know you're living in exile when you feel separated from everything that is comfortable and familiar to you. Then you're in exile. You know you're living in exile when you're living in a place that you don't want to live, doing stuff that you don't want to do, surrounded by people that you don't much want to be with. Everyone, even though we may not use this language, everyone experiences exile at some time or some seasons in life. Major life changes can push us into exile, like a cross-country job transition, an early retirement. Unexpected changes in our family can push us into exile, like when you become empty nesters, like when a spouse dies, when you go through divorce. There are other things in life that can push you into exile as well. Like if you start in a new school, if you are diagnosed and begin suffering from a long-term illness, all of these events can put us in a place of exile. But you know the surest way of knowing if you're living in exile right now is if you're asking this very ordinary question: why does life seem so unfair? That's a very ordinary question. We've probably all asked that at some point. Some of us maybe are asking that now. But that very ordinary question can lead to an extraordinary new chapter in God's life for you. Why is life so unfair? That, my friends, was the question that the prophet Jeremiah tried answering for a group of people living in utter and total exile. Okay, remember last week I mentioned to you that during Jeremiah's ministry, just a little like geography, history here, during Jeremiah's ministry, the Jewish nation was divided into two separate kingdoms. There was the northern kingdom, which was called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. Now, sandwiched between the northern and southern kingdom were the superpowers of the day. Remember who I said were the two big superpowers of the day? They were what? Egypt to the south, Babylon to the north, right? In 598 BCE, one of these two superpowers, the Babylonians, they came down from the north. They conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. They deported all of the best and the brightest back to the shores of the Tigris and the Euphrates, back into Babylon, where they lived in exile against their will. 11 short years later, 587 BC, Babylon came down through the northern kingdom of Israel, and they conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. They sacked Jerusalem, and they deported many of the best and the brightest back into Babylonian captivity, where they lived in exile. But in those 11 years between Judah, the northern kingdom, being sacked, Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom, in between in those intervening 11 years, the Jews who were living in Babylonian exile, they did a lot of complaining, a lot of sulking. And their complaints sounded something like this: a terrible thing has happened to us. Okay. We know that we've not been very faithful to God, but we're no worse than the rest of those people who are living at home down in Judah. But here we are in this God-forsaken place. Why us, God? Why us? These Babylonians, they smell terribly. We don't understand their stupid language. The food here is disgusting. The weather is awful. Oh God, this is so unfair. Well, making matters worse for the exiles who were living in Babylon was the presence of 3 false prophets in this community of exiles. They were constantly stirring the pot of discontent. Their sermons became communal pity parties. They were always telling the Jews in Babylonian exile that they were victims, always promising them that any moment now God is going to come and return you to your homeland in Israel. Well, one day, two messengers from Jerusalem carrying an official note to the king of Babylon stopped and visited with this community of exiles. And they read a letter addressed to the community of exiles from the great prophet of God, Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah 29, which we read just a little while ago, gives us a glimpse of the content of this letter sent by God's prophet Jeremiah to these people living in exile. This is what we know of the letter. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens, eat the produce. Take wives, have sons and daughters. Seek the welfare of the city. Pray to the Lord on its behalf. Jeremiah's letter was devastating. It was utterly devastating to the Jews who were living in exile, hoping that God would be soon to rescue them. It's as if Jeremiah was saying to these Jews in exile, folks, you're not camping in Babylon. This is your new home. Get used to it. Can you imagine how demoralizing that must have been for these people, hoping, complaining, waiting? Jeremiah said, plant gardens. Plant gardens? In other words, be productive where you are instead of dreaming about where you're not. Jeremiah said to these people, take wives, have sons and daughters. In other words, you know these foul-smelling Babylonians? Guess what? They're now your neighbors. And they might soon be your in-laws. Jeremiah's letter provided very, very little comfort to people who were feeling utterly, totally, and completely like life was so unfair. There was very little comfort in this letter. But one thing this letter did was it made the people in exile choose. It forced them into an important decision. They could choose to wallow in self-pity, play the role of victim, or they could choose to remain faithful, trusting in God, determined to live life at its best. When we go through periods of life, when we feel life is so unfair, quite frankly, when we ask that question of God, we're forced with much of the same decision. We can choose to wallow in self-pity, play the role of the victim, or we can choose to remain faithful, trusting in God, determined to live life at its best. I'm convinced that this is what the letter of Jeremiah was saying to God's people in exile. Life may not be fair. Nobody promised it's going to be fair. So you'll have a choice. You can choose self-pity, play the victim, or you can choose to remain faithful to God, trusting in God, determined to live life right here, right now, at its best. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who was imprisoned in the death camps of Germany. How many of you have read Man's Search for Meaning or are familiar with it? A couple of you have. I was acquainted with Viktor Frankl and his work when I was going through my divorce, when I was daily tempted to ask God, why is life so unfair? His work really helped make that ordinary question for me lead to an extraordinary new chapter in my life. Let me tell you his story. His parents, his brother, his wife, they all died in the gas ovens of Nazi Germany. He was imprisoned there as well. During his time in the Nazi concentration camps, he suffered torture, innumerable indignities. He never knew from one minute to the next if he was going to live or die. Yet he lived his days in a death camp with this uncommon, uncompromising hope and courage. It inspired the people around him. Even the guards, the Nazi guards, remarked about the powerful influence Viktor Frankl's life had on them. He was a towering figure. But one day, naked, alone, and cold in a small room next to the gas ovens, used to kill his fellow Jews, Viktor Frankl felt himself falling into utter helplessness. But in that moment, something extraordinary happened. In that moment, Viktor Frankl became aware of what he later called the last of the human freedoms. He knew that the Nazi captors, they could take away his clothes, He knew they could take away his family. They knew he could take away his future and his vocation. They knew they could take away his food. He knew that they could even take away his life. But in that cold, dark room, Viktor Frankl came to the realization there was one thing that the Nazis couldn't take away from him. You know what that was? It was his ability to choose. Frankl realized that he possessed the freedom to choose whether to give up or carry on. They could take every single thing from him, but they could not take away his ability to choose how he was going to respond to every situation in life. Whatever his choice, the Nazis couldn't take that away from him. Frankl once wrote this. He said, "I could not change the situation that caused my suffering, but I could still choose my attitude towards that suffering." Those words helped me a lot when I was tempted to wallow in a pity party. Feel sorry for myself. When I was asking God, why is life so unfair? I recovered the freedom and the power of choice. We all have the power to choose, and most importantly, life, friends, life finds its meaning when we choose how we choose to respond when life is just not fair. In fact, I believe the gateway to an extraordinary new chapter in your life is based on how you choose to respond when you feel life is unfair. I think this was God's message to the people in exile who were feeling like life is just totally unfair. Nobody knew this better than the Apostle Paul, how the power of choice can lead to an extraordinary life. Paul endured more hardships, y'all. He endured more suffering. He was on the short end of more sticks than any other Christian around. In his letter to the church at Philippi that we read earlier, the early part of the letter, he shares about his suffering, the trials, the challenges that he faces to be faithful to what Jesus is calling him to do. And he comes up with a summary statement. He says, "Only live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ." Paul knew that following Jesus meant that life was not going to be very fair. But he also knew he had the power to choose. He could choose to brood, to blame, to be a victim. Or he could choose to live in a manner worthy of the gospel. It's easy to fall into the trap of complaining that life's not fair. And if we choose to follow Jesus Christ seriously throughout our life, unquestionably, there's going to be times when we're going to ask God, why is life so unfair? But that question can lead to an extraordinary new chapter in your life, but only if we remember that we have the freedom and the power to choose how we respond when life is unfair. This past week, I was on the phone with a kiddo who was in my high school youth group a long time ago. Because I saw on Facebook, he's now in his 30s, late 30s. And he put on Facebook that he had just been diagnosed with ALS. He had just gotten remarried 3 years ago. He had a 14-month-old son. I spent about an hour with him on the phone. Uncommon amount of courage, grace, and dignity. Through it all, he kept telling me the same message. He didn't choose to have ALS, but he's going to choose how he responds to ALS. And he's going to choose to remain faithful to God, trusting that in life and death and life to come, he belongs to God. He said, ALS may be breaking my body, but it's not going to break me. If you're asking why is life so unfair, remember, we have the power to choose. We have the power to choose. We can choose to be the victim. We can choose to live life at its best in a manner worthy of the gospel. One choice is going to leave us in a very ordinary life. The other choice can lead to an extraordinary new chapter in our life. But either way, the choice is ours.